Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Minor, executed 30 BCE. The son of the Triumvir, and the grandson of the famous rebel of 78, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Minor inherited a famous, if controversial, patrician name, and grew up with a reasonable expectation of achieving greatness. When he was a teenager, his father formed the Second Triumvirate, and Lepidus Minor even played a small role in the political drama leading up to that achievement. However, things turned rather sour after the Battle of Philippi, when Octavian effectively sidelined Marcus's father, only to partially restore him as the governor of Africa in 40. Following a successful joint campaign between Lepidus and Octavian against Sextus Pompeius, Lepidus the Triumvir was formally deposed and left to live on as the first and only Pontifex Maximus to work from home while under house arrest. Lepidus Minor's prospects also took a hit, as his long-standing engagement to Antonia, Mark Antony's eldest daughter, was called off. Over the next 6 years, Lepidus Minor began his Senate career and also married Servilia. The two of them became something of a love match, at least so far as we can tell. However, another thing in Lepidus Minor's heart aside from love was righteous indignation at the way that his father had been treated by Octavian. In true Roman aristocratic fashion, therefore, the young senator began to plot to murder Octavian, only for his plot to be detected and foiled early in the planning stages. By losing his life in this way, Lepidus Minor forced yet another grievous blow upon his father. Here is the tragedy of the short-lived and little documented Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Minor. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Minor was born into perhaps some of the most favorable circumstances that any Roman noble was ever born into, and his circumstances continued to improve over the course of his early life. His grandfather, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, had been a consul and had been disgraced as a part of a major revolt that he had led in 78 to 77, and one of his other grandfathers was the co-leader, Marcus Junius Brutus, the praetor of 83. But those men and their condemnation really had not slowed the family down any. When young Marcus was born, his father, his uncle, and his other uncle, Marcus Junius Brutus, were all rising stars in Roman politics. In fact, the most important family member who was alive at the time no doubt would have been his uncle Aemilius Paulus, the older brother of the future Triumvir. Marcus had a younger brother, born probably a few years after him, named Quintus, about whom we know rather little. There's a pretty good chance that Quintus either had a disability or that he died young, because we have no evidence that he ever went into Roman politics. Marcus also had a cousin, also named Quintus, and he later would join up with Mark Antony and go on to be consul in 21. Even if his father had failed to become a triumvir, Lepidus Minor had a good enough pedigree that he most likely would have become a consul one way or another, provided that the Republic continued to exist. The primary asset that his father had that would make him such a player in politics and enable him to really surpass even his older brother, who had already been consul, was that Lepidus Sr. was good friends with Julius Caesar, the greatest man in Roman politics, or at least a man who was rapidly becoming that, becoming first a rival of Pompey and then starting to eclipse him as his Gallic War wound down. We believe that Lepidus Minor was born around 60 BCE, so right before the formation of the First Triumvirate. So his early years would have been marked by knowledge of the street battles between Clodius and Milo. And he was a teenager, perhaps around 16 years old, when his father formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Antony. So Lepidus Minor's early years were tumultuous, but certainly seem to have instilled in him a sense of adventure and a willingness to take risk. Lepidus Minor was no doubt grateful that the assassins of Caesar decided not to go after Caesar's closest associates, including his father and Mark Antony. Lepidus Senior actually was perhaps the most powerful man on the Ides of March after the daggers had been put away. He had troops nearby, just outside of Rome, and he actually was with them at the time of the murder. So it fell to Lepidus Senior to effectively decide what would happen to the assassins, and he ultimately, in consultation with Antony, decided upon a conciliatory path. So the two of them, in consultation with the Senate majority, decided that there would be a general amnesty forgiving the assassins for their deed. And the two major assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were not entirely sure that they were safe. They had earlier tried to address a crowd, and things had gone rather poorly when the praetor Cinna, a former brother-in-law of Caesar, had denounced the dictator and gotten the crowd whipped up into a killing frenzy. And so in order to try to preserve their own safety, they were looking for guarantees from Lepidus and Antony. And so in order to reassure Brutus and Cassius, Lepidus Minor and also Antony's oldest son were sent as hostages to the Capitoline Hill where the conspirators had holed up, and they personally escorted each man out. Other noble sons went to escort the other assassins. So, arguably, if we consider Brutus to be the highest profile of the assassins, Lepidus Minor had the honor of escorting him out away from the capital and into the Senate. And at the age of 16, he would have been old enough to appreciate the gravity of the moment and his place in history. It also would have worked out pretty well that Brutus happened to be his uncle, since he knew that Brutus would most likely not try to do anything that would harm him if worse came to worse and the crowd tried to attack them. And of course his father was the man in charge of the troops protecting them, so while he did face some danger, ultimately Lepidus Minor knew that things were most likely going to work out and that he would get home. The initial spirit of reconciliation broke down within months, largely due to the machinations on the one hand of Mark Antony, and on the other hand of men like Cicero and Decimus Brutus. This led to a war between Decimus Brutus and Mark Antony in northern Italy. Lepidus got involved, as did a number of other figures, including a young Octavian, who was Caesar's primary heir and had the allegiance of many of Caesar's men. When the campaign culminated in a couple of battles in the north, including Mutina, three men got together, Lepidus, Antony, and Octavian, and they hammered out their differences to form the second Triumvirate. When we talk about Lepidus, the Triumvir, we'll talk about how it's very likely that he was the peacemaker out of the group and that the Triumvirate was largely his idea. At any rate, the Triumvirate would form in 43, and they would decide that their first priority had to be getting rid of Brutus, Cassius, and the other assassins. Lepidus didn't want to partake in this campaign in person, perhaps because Brutus was his brother-in-law, as I've mentioned before, and he felt it might be inappropriate. Besides, Lepidus seems to have been most comfortable as an administrator, so he stayed home in Rome and allowed his men to go with Antony and Octavian. When Antony and Octavian won the Battle of Philippi and conquered the eastern half of the Roman Republic, when they came back, they were a little bit less interested in working with Lepidus, who had given up most of his leverage. So Octavian more or less sidelined him on some trumped-up charges, and only in 40 sort of restored him as a triumvir, but with severely reduced power and troop numbers. So Lepidus was confined to 2 provinces in Africa, including Numidia, and he would govern there for about 4 years, largely peacefully and with some popularity. Most likely Lepidus Minor was present and worked alongside of his father, gaining experience as an administrator and a soldier. There's a very good chance that in 36, when Lepidus and Octavian decided to coordinate their efforts to try to get rid of Sextus Pompeius, who was stationed in Sicily and in Sardinia and Corsica with his pirate fleet, there's a very good chance that Lepidus Minor partook in this complex double-pronged, or actually triple-pronged invasion. And he also was probably in camp at the time when Octavian arranged for Lepidus's men to desert him. and this led to the formal deposition of Lepidus as a Triumvir. Lepidus would no longer have any power in Rome politically. He hadn't really done anything wrong. In fact, in the campaign against Sextus Pompeius, he had, almost on an objective level, performed better than Octavian and his generals. He had done more to defeat Sextus than the rest, and yet he was being branded as a kind of traitor, and all his powers were stripped away from him. Part of the reason why Octavian couldn't kill him, however, is because Lepidus was Pontifex Maximus, and to kill him would be impious. So Octavian's hope was that Lepidus would despair and take his own life, and that did not come to pass. We don't really know what the elder Lepidus's feelings were, but we can guess he was probably pretty resentful and may have had some choice words around the house about how he really felt about Octavian. But the younger Lepidus was a little less circumspect, and it's very, very clear that he absolutely despised Octavian and quite literally wanted to kill him. Part of the reason for Lepidus Minor's extreme anger and resentment was that not only did this humiliate his father, and by extension his entire family, but there was a component that impacted him in a more personal way. Back when the Second Triumvirate formed in the fall of 43, one of the ways that the three men bound themselves together is that they had some interfamilial marriages, and one of them was for an engagement between Lepidus Minor and Antony's eldest daughter, Antonia. If this marriage had gone through, then Lepidus Minor would have been intimately connected with the cause of Mark Antony, who clearly had a much stronger position than his father did, and also probably a stronger position than Octavian for most of this period. As late as 37, it appeared that this wedding was still going to happen, that Lepidus's demotion to sort of sub-triumvir would not affect his son's marriage prospects. Perhaps simply there was no better match for Antonia, despite Lepidus Minor having had his stock lowered. But in 37, Antony sent his freedman Callias to Africa to request that the wedding between the two take place before he embarked upon what he hoped would be a conquest of Parthia, and something that he knew would keep him away for quite a long time. Dio Cassius said that the wedding actually happened, but most scholars believe that it was actually called off right after Octavian deposed Lepidus. And why is this relevant to the deposition of the elder Lepidus? Well, Octavian, either because he actually believed this or because he was using it as a pretext, claims that Callias did not go to Africa to discuss the wedding arrangement, but rather was coordinating efforts between Lepidus and Antony to screw over Octavian. So he was accusing Lepidus effectively of plotting against him with Antony, even though Antony was not present for the campaign against Sextus Pompeius, and Lepidus had done his part to bring about a victory. So this is part of why Lepidus Minor was so aggrieved with Octavian. As for Antonia, she actually would not go on to marry any Roman senators, but rather to marry an old, wealthy Greek man named Pythodorus of Travails. Antony needed money. Wars are expensive, and some of his wars in the East went rather poorly, so he needed a lot of money. And his daughter had to marry an old guy with money. So there you go. And Lepidus Minor, of course, also found a new bride. Lepidus Minor's engagement to his intended Antonia was broken off in 36. At some point after that, perhaps even before 36 was out, he married Servilia. Servilia would prove to be quite a good match for him, as the two shared at least one major thing in common: a seething, undying hatred of Octavian. Servilia, in all likelihood, was the daughter of the Caesarian consul of 48 and 41, Publius Servilius Assaracus. Servilius had served as consul twice, and had come into disgrace in his second consulship when he failed to do enough to aid his former almost son-in-law Octavian. The Parisine War, of course, was where Mark Antony's younger brother Lucius, along with Antony's wife Fulvia, had effectively launched a revolt against Octavian, and as a sitting consul, Servilius Isauricus had not done nearly enough to aid Octavian, and so Octavian now held him in low regard. We also have to remember that there's a very good chance that Lepidus Minor and Servilia knew each other and had for a long time, and perhaps they finally realized that they were the best match either could have based on their family's fallen circumstances. If this is indeed the daughter of Servilius Isauricus, then her mother was Junia Prima, thus making her a first cousin of Lepidus Minor, since Junia Prima is the older sister of Junia Secunda, Lepidus's mom. This Servilia, again assuming that it is in fact the daughter of the former two-time consul, at one point was Octavian's intended bride back before the Ides of March and before the formation of the Second Triumvirate. However, when Octavian formed a pact with Lepidus and Antony, he had broken off that engagement and decided instead to marry Antony's stepdaughter Claudia, the daughter of Fulvia by her previous husband. So despite the fact that Lepidus Minor's father was involved in the procedures that led to her breakup with Octavian, Servilia seems to have held a grudge from that. And because Roman marriages were usually not based on love, that is a somewhat unusual circumstance that you have someone like Servilia who holds a grudge over a broken engagement. Which is why I happen to think that the most likely reason for both her visceral hatred of Octavian and for Lepidus Minor's is that both of them were extremely angry at how Octavian had disgraced their fathers. We have to remember, Octavian was only about 4 years older than Lepidus Minor and probably about the same number of years older than Servilia. So they were watching a person who was of an age to be with them in high school, if they had had high schools in Rome, bullying their parents. And they were not taking kindly to that. So the visceral hatred was really building up, and the two of them were very much of one mind about Octavian being a menace to the Roman public. The elder Lepidus was in a rather peculiar state after he was deposed as Triumvir. He retained a lot of his titles. He was still Pontifex Maximus, and he was still a consular, so he was entitled to speak in the Senate. However, he also was kind of under house arrest and was expected to remain at Circe unless summoned to Rome directly by Octavian or one of Octavian's close allies. However, those restrictions did not apply to anyone else in the family, and in fact, Lepidus Minor was free to pursue his own political career. He also was free to travel about as he pleased, as was his mother. And one thing that's interesting about the marriage of Lepidus, the former Triumvir, and Junia Secunda is that they had only ever been married to one another, and so their marriage may have actually been a love connection. So Junia Secunda was kind of understood to be a representative of Lepidus and his interests. The two of them were bonded for life. So whatever business the former Triumvir and current Pontifex Maximus had was largely being handled by his family members, since he was not at liberty to travel freely. And despite what had happened to his father, and despite Octavian frequently insulting the elder Lepidus in the Senate through all kinds of various means, such as calling upon him to speak last, even after some people who were lower in rank than him, despite that, the younger Lepidus was able to win an election and become a quaestor, and he was starting to rise through the ranks. In 31, Octavian decided that it was time to settle the score with Antony, after Antony had suffered a major defeat in the east, and so Octavian raised his forces and went to fight the campaign that would culminate in the Battle of Actium. In the meantime, he left one of his best friends, and perhaps his most able advisor, Gaius Maecenas, in charge at Rome. This, Lepidus Minor thought, could be an opportunity to really set things right. But perhaps he didn't really know the capabilities of Gaius Maecenas. During the time when Maecenas was in charge in Rome, Lepidus Minor was arrested and accused of plotting to murder Octavian. We don't really know any details about this supposed plot. We have no idea what Lepidus's plan was, or who he might have been working with. In fact, based on the lack of evidence about this plot, it's very likely that Lepidus was in the very early planning stage of it, and that he may have even been betrayed by the first person he approached about this. It may have been that he didn't even get around to planning this because he was simply drunk and talking big at a party to the wrong person. But the fact that his plot, whether it was real or not, was discovered so early, while Octavian was nowhere near Rome, implies very heavily that Maecenas and Octavian's agents were very closely monitoring his activities, and that they had suspected for a while that he might be a problem. It also shows that by this time, Octavian had killed and replaced so many senators that the body was absolutely full of people who were primarily loyal to him rather than to the Senate as an institution, or especially to, say, the son of a fallen Triumvir who had once been a rival of Octavian in days gone by. Presumably, assuming that there actually was a full-fledged plan, the idea was something like an Ides of March scenario, where the only way to get close to Octavian would be to approach him with a petition. And because Lepidus Minor probably didn't have quite enough circumspection to disguise the fact that he was disgusted by how his father was being treated, maybe the petition could be something as simple as, "Please allow my father to reside in Rome to better do his duties as Pontifex Maximus." And he could use that as an excuse to get close to Octavian with a few guys, and hopefully do some dagger work quickly before Octavian's guards saved his life and killed the senators involved. Richard D. Weigel, who is, to the best of my knowledge, the only biographer of Lepidus the Triumvir, thinks that Lepidus Minor was most likely trying to appeal to the disenchanted among the populace. So this would mean that he was potentially trying to advance the idea that Octavian was not a true Caesarian looking out for the interest of the common people, and that he may have been in poor neighborhoods trying to raise class resentment. It's hard to say, but my suspicion is that Lepidus Minor was actually trying to work with people who had grievances on a personal level, and that's partly because Octavian had largely managed Rome relatively well in the last few years, at least. Now, of course, he will only really bring about great prosperity after Actium and when the civil wars are over and a lot of the veterans are being settled. That being said, he did pay out the benefits that Caesar laid out in his will, and it would be pretty hard to make a case that Octavian had really failed to live up to his end of the deal as a popularis, and that Lepidus would be a better bet in that regard. So my suspicion is that Weigel's wrong about that, and that this was an attempt to get a small coterie together to get rid of Octavian. Once he was arrested under Maecenas' direction, Marcus was either tried and executed right there in Rome, presumably by the presiding praetor, or if we follow Appian's account, he was sent to Octavian in the east, who judged and executed him on his own authority. Based on the package of powers that Octavian had, he could have legally done that, but it would not have necessarily looked very good. Octavian was trying already, although he would get better at it over time, to give off the appearance of just being another magistrate within the Republic, so allowing the normal courts to handle Lepidus and put him to death would most likely be more Octavian style. The less personal involvement, the less it looks like it is based on his personal will or his personal animosity for the Lepidus family. So my suspicion is that Maecenas directed things from behind the scenes, and the officials of Rome took care of things, and Octavian was most likely consulted by mail. It's also worth mentioning, for those who might not know, Maecenas was actually not a senator, he was an equestrian, and so him being in charge of Rome was a very unofficial thing that was understood because of his connection to Augustus, well, the future Augustus, Octavian, but it was never formal in any way. As for Lepidus Minor's widow, Servilia, rather than live with yet another insult from Octavian, she chose to protest by taking her own life by swallowing hot coals. Junia Secunda, Lepidus Minor's mother, was implicated as well. Again, we're not sure exactly how, because we know so little about the details of what Lepidus Minor was planning, and so she was brought up on charges in Rome. And this required the elder Lepidus, who generally had his travel restricted, to come away from the beach and show up in Rome in order to plead on her behalf. And this was yet another humiliation for the elder Lepidus, who was frequently, as I mentioned, insulted in the Senate by Octavian. But this time he had to actually plead for his wife's life by basically groveling at the feet of someone whom had once been on a prescription list due to him, and that would be the praetor Balbinus. And I can't help but wonder if this Balbinus is perhaps a distant ancestor of the gout-ridden and completely incompetent emperor from the 3rd century. Junia Secunda made bail, and we don't really know what Octavian decided once he got it home, but most likely he decided to let her off the hook. It doesn't appear that she was put to death, or at least we have no record of it. However, make no mistake about it, the death of Lepidus Minor was certainly another blow to the deposed Triumvir, Lepidus the Elder. Lepidus Minor, to be sure, is not as significant as his father or his grandfather. However, he is still a somewhat more than minor figure, I would say. While the name Marcus Aemilius Lepidus would live on due to other branches of the family, his early death meant that he never had any kids to carry on the direct line of Lepidus the Triumvir. He also seems to have perhaps been one of the last martyrs of the Republic. And that sounds a little ridiculous at first blush, because of course he was fighting on behalf of his father, who was a kind of extra-constitutional official by being a Triumvir. That being said, we have to remember that in the minds of most Roman nobles, the Republic is coterminous with their own family. And the more public-minded Roman elites would see Rome as a collection of the great families, and not just their own. So, to really personalize politics in that way would not be unusual, and to have a grandiose understanding of one's own significance would also not be odd at all for a Roman of Lepidus Minor's class. And so, it's very possible that he believed that he was really following in the footsteps of his uncle, Brutus, and that he might die in the endeavor, but that he might restore the Republic. Or perhaps he would at least get vengeance for his father, and that he would in some way be just and noble and pious even. So most likely, in his own mind, Lepidus Minor was a hero, and there's no way you could have convinced him otherwise. As for his father, the deposed Triumvir, he would live all the way until about the end of 13 or perhaps the very beginning of 12, and he lived to be perhaps around 80 years old. One has to imagine that his son's death would have saddened him considerably. However, while Octavian was eagerly awaiting the older man's death, he was disappointed, no doubt, to learn that even depression was not enough to kill off old Lepidus. And so, in the years after Lepidus Minor's death, Octavian would become increasingly open about his desire to see the older Lepidus drop dead. My personal feeling is that the only way Lepidus could fight back against Octavian, because he couldn't really argue with him in the Senate, and he also couldn't do anything physically, the only thing he could do to really screw over Octavian was to stay alive, so that way his title of Pontifex Maximus would stay out of Octavian's grasp. So, in sort of my headcanon, Lepidus the deposed Triumvir was seeking out help from every medical professional he could find in terms of how to live healthy and extend his life as long as possible, because that little passive-aggressive action is the only thing he could do to get at Octavian. And apparently he got to Octavian pretty hard, because as Octavian grew up and matured, he became much better at decorum, yet just the very existence of Lepidus still offended him. And when Lepidus died, he did not try to disguise his sheer joy at the fact that he could now be elected Pontifex Maximus. And so he more or less celebrated Lepidus's death. And I believe that this episode with Lepidus Minor may have played a big role in further personalizing and exacerbating the split between the two former co-triumvirs. Another thing that's significant about Lepidus Minor is that his romance with Servilia is something that I think is worthy of greater exploration. We can't really say too much about it in detail because obviously we don't have the sources, but fiction writers should get on that. I mean, swallowing hot coals in order to show your disgust at what has happened to your loved one, I mean, that's some pretty hardcore stuff. So I think there should be a miniseries, at least, that goes into the life of the very dramatic Lepidus Minor and his equally dramatic wife Servilia. So that is all for now. I will be back in the near future. Until then, I am and shall remain Thersites the Historian. Don't swallow hot coals, but if you do, make sure that people know about it so that way the drama of it is recorded forever.